Marjory, tell us about what's happening internationally in setting standards for interpretation.
Well, I think the most exciting news is definitely what's coming out of ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. 4 years ago, when I first heard that ISO, as it's pronounced by those inside, that ISO was making standards for interpreting and translation, I was stunned. I sort of associated them with light bulbs and consumer products. And the next thing I knew, I was personally involved in, of all standards, a standard for community interpreting. And I learned as I became involved as part of the US delegation that a conscious decision had been made by those in the language subcommittee of a larger part of ISO to focus initially not on general interpreting or conference interpreting, as you might think, but on community interpreting, because the need there was so great and so urgent. And that's how I became involved, because that's truly my area of greatest professional specialization on all levels is community interpreting. The idea of being involved with 29 different countries, coming together once a year in a different country every year, communicating otherwise by WebEx and other means to push forward standards for interpreting, I think represents the highest international level of collaboration on standardization for interpreting that I have heard of. As of this year, while we are still wrapping up, I hope with a future publication of the Community Interpreting Standard next year, because these are multi-year projects, we are initiating, and I'm the project leader for it, the first standard on general interpreting to come out of ISO. So this will be like an umbrella standard under which specialized standards, including the community interpreting standard, will fall. And we hope to see, for example, an upcoming standard on legal and court interpreting. I'm sure one will follow at some point for conference interpreting. It has even been proposed that there be a separate standard for medical interpreting, although medical interpreting would seem to fall under community interpreting because it has such specialized needs. So this is an extraordinarily exciting development, and I'm really thrilled to be part of it. I don't think many people know about it yet at an international level, so I'm delighted that you asked the question. Hopefully more people will know as a result and spread the word.
So what kind of thing would actually be regulated in a standard like that?
Well, I think the important thing to understand about ISO standards is that they're basically there's 5 separate kinds of publications, but for practical purpose, an international standard, or IS, is the most important type of standard they produce. And there are 2 subcategories of IS, or international standard: a guideline standard and a requirement standards. A guidance or guideline standard is filled with recommendations. So these are still international recommendations. They have a general weight. They can't be too specific because they're technically applying to any country in the world, unless, of course, there are any kinds of national regulations or laws or legislation that would go against it. The national rules and legislation always supersede an ISO standard. But the requirement standard would be stricter. In order to say that you're compliant with a requirement standard, you have to comply with every part of that standard, and therefore organizations can create certification programs. So those are much stricter. And to give you an idea for comparison purposes, the community interpreting standard that we hope to see published next year would be a guidelines or guidance standard, whereas the general interpreting standard I just mentioned, that would cover all sectors and all settings of interpreting, would be a requirement standard. So there might be language organizations, language service providers that would be certified to be compliant with that standard, which is pretty exciting.
So what kind of thing is actually regulated? Is it things like training, like rest periods, like working conditions? What does it look at?
Well, certainly in the case of the community interpreting standard, those are all recommendations, and they do get somewhat specific. One of the great areas of discussion was, well, and we still haven't finalized it, but how long should you interpret, consecutively or simultaneously, before giving the interpreter a rest break. So it does break down into details, not into training requirements that are specific as how long what length of training program an interpreter should undergo, because there is no international consensus and the pragmatic realities are simply too complicated. But there's a fair level of detail into what constitutes a qualified community interpreter. Questions like should they in fact be tested for language proficiency before training and so on. Those are the kinds of things that are being addressed. The requirement standard for general interpreting, I don't know what the decisions will be made or how specific. It may be an interesting challenge to get consensus.
What kind of bodies or people or representatives participate in this work?
That's the fascinating thing for me. It turns out in every country that has a member body, a delegation, a national delegation, it's always organized under the auspices of the National Standards Institute or organization for that country. So the national delegation goes to that standards organization and has a mirror committee. Not everyone will physically travel to the annual in-person meeting, but whoever does, or however many people from each country do, will go back and consult with the members who are not part of that National Standards Institute, but are organized under the auspices of that. Another interesting feature is that each country gets one vote. So you could send 10 delegates or one delegate. You could have 2 delegates in your nation or 12, it doesn't matter. And you could be Bulgaria or the United States, you have one vote.
Have you, in your work in the ISO committee, detected any tensions or contradictions between groups of countries, or are you all very much agreed on which way to travel?
That's a delicate question. In truth, I've observed unquestionably some interesting tensions and kind of had to navigate and learn myself. On a strictly human level, I think a lot of these are actually issues of intercultural communication. As soon as people, and this has been a wonderful learning experience for me personally, as soon as people from almost any country around the world feel heard, feel valued, feel that their input matters, and that their human dignity is respected, the communication styles cease to matter very much, and suddenly collaboration increases, and so does consensus. So I think there's tremendous cause for optimism, specifically on the interpreting standards, because I can watch us, I can observe us, learning that, figuring that out, and it's really a very joyful experience as we do. And we also learn that if somebody is abrupt and direct, it really doesn't mean that they're angry, upset. It is often just a cultural communication style, nothing more than that.